Hello, my name is Sam Wong. I run a research laboratory in neuroscience, and I teach students about that subject at Princeton University, my school. In this course, what I'm going to do is show you neuroscience. And I'm going to bring you inside the mind of a neuroscientist and see how we look at everyday life. Now, we all, of course, all experience everyday life, but what I want to do is show you your everyday life in terms of what your brain is doing. So let's think of some examples. For example, in the last few months, you've made some decisions, some big ones. You've learned some things. You've probably forgotten other things. Maybe you've fallen in love or fallen for an illusion, seen a shadow that looks a little bit different once you look at it more closely. Or, like me, maybe you've traveled through some time zones or tried to get a 2-year-old to like vegetables. Now, as a working neuroscientist, I often think about such everyday experiences at two levels. One, of course, is just normal experience, trying to get the 2-year-old to eat the vegetables. But also, I think about such experiences in relation to how the brain works as a biological organ. In this course, here's what we're going to do. We're going to examine the brain activity and the brain mechanisms underlying all sorts of everyday phenomena. And what we'll do is try to understand why the brain does tricky things, some things that perhaps are not very intuitive, not very computer-like, for instance, all in the interest of keeping us alive. Now, the workings of the mind have been interesting to people for a long time. For millennia, people have been thinking about the workings of their own minds. And it's been possible to think about the workings of the mind in various ways. Now, way back when people did not have biological mechanisms, did not have experimental methods, people thought about the mind from a philosophical standpoint. And at that time, people got very interested in fundamental questions that were not investigatable by probing the brain, questions of a philosophical nature like what it means to be conscious thinking beings. Do we truly have free will? What does it mean to pay attention? What does it mean to look at a sunset? And that was perhaps a relatively distant way of thinking about the mind. Now, since that time, of course, there have been other ways of looking at behavior and at mind. And another approach has been to look at behavior as a scientific question. And now we shift over to thinking about mental mechanisms and problems of mind from the standpoint of looking at an animal or a human behave. And I said animal, so it turns out that now we shift into fields that include not only human behavior, but also animal behavior. And if we think about this, this includes many behavioral sciences that are active today. For instance, psychology, psychiatry, going back to the writings of Freud, sociology, anthropology, and indeed even economics. All of these are disciplines that concern themselves in one way or another with human behavior or animal behavior. Now that's the backdrop for now what I'm going to come to and what's going to be the topic of this course. And that's as follows. In the last 50 years, it's become possible to think of mental activity in terms of the biological organ that generates thought, namely the brain. And when we think about brain function, now we have these philosophical and behavioral points of view, and they're invigorated by this new field, neuroscience. Now I said new field. Neuroscience as a field did not exist 100 years ago. At the time, perhaps there was neurology, there was biology, certainly other fields like chemistry and physics existed. But since that time, neuroscience has become a thriving discipline. It's really boomed in the last few decades. And what we've seen in the last few decades is that neuroscience has started to provide mechanistic, biologically oriented explanations for every aspect of behavior. All of these fields that I've talked about before, economic behavior, social behavior, psychiatric disorders. In all these ways, neuroscience has something new to offer. Now, all these explanations that I'm going to be telling you about in the coming lectures address or affect many aspects of our lives. So I'm going to be talking about our thoughts, our mental health, and how we live our lives. And one thing that I'm going to be doing in this course is explaining or at least describing some of these phenomena in terms of brain regions. I'm going to talk about specific brain regions, and I'll be showing you some brain regions in this lecture. Brain regions that seem to be involved in generating these behaviors. And I'm going to start from the very highest level of describing behavior, things that you experience in your everyday lives. I'm going to start taking that down to biological mechanisms. I'm going to take it down to circuits, to brain regions, to cells, and to the chemicals that neurons use to signal within themselves, between them, and so on. So I'm going to be showing you neuroscience as it pertains to all these mental phenomena, these behavioral phenomena. Now, neuroscience is a big field. There are tens of thousands of neuroscientists in the United States today, and that's been a giant growth in the last few decades. There are over 100,000 of us worldwide. And so neuroscience is a large, booming field. Now, let me give you just a little bit of context. Let me tell you a little bit about how I became a neuroscientist. Now, I started on the road to becoming a neuroscientist over 20 years ago when I was a child, I wanted to be a scientist. I wanted to do something deep, something important. And when I went to college, I began as a physics major. Now, why physics? Well, I think to fans of science, it's fairly obvious. Physics seems like the most fundamental of sciences. Physics addresses how matter works, how objects move, starting from atoms and planets, stars, galaxies. So at all these different levels, I think to anyone growing up at the time that I was growing up, physics was a powerful discipline. But I noticed something in my studies of physics as a student. The thing I noticed was that great discoveries in physics had occurred at a high rate in the first half of the 20th century, then slowed down. And so if you look at the period of time, say, between 1890 and 1950, that was a time when there seemed to be a new discovery every year, new particles, new fundamental principles, relativity, quantum mechanics, many things that were being discovered in that time. But starting towards the end of that time, the time between discoveries started getting longer, and that's especially true in the second half of the 20th century. And I thought, just for selfish reasons, I wanted to make some kind of significant contribution to science within my lifetime. And so I wanted to work in a field in which I could make a contribution, just as an individual investigator, maybe with people I collaborated with. But I also still wanted to work in a field that was fundamental in a philosophical sense. So if we think back on reasons to care about physics, reasons I cared about physics, one can come up with philosophical reasons for working on some fields as being more fundamental in the way that they ask questions. So I'll give you a few examples. One example that I was attracted to was fundamental physics, what the universe is made of, what the nature of particles, matter, energy are, that kind of thing. Another example is astrophysics, how it all got here, the origins of the universe. But the field that I chose was neuroscience, which is how we're able to ask the first two questions in the first place. So after making this decision, this happened in college, I went off to neuroscience graduate school. Now, it took a while to adapt to my newly chosen field because, after all, I was a physicist and I had to learn biology, I had to learn neuroanatomy, I had to learn a lot of different things, and it took time to adapt. But it's a choice I've never regretted, and I think it's the best time ever to be a neuroscientist. Now, there is another reason to care about the brain. My own reason was philosophical because I wanted to understand the fundamental nature of mental processes. That was my original aspiration. But of course, there's another reason, a very common reason, medical. Now, just as the heart moves blood or parts of the pancreas make insulin, the brain is an organ that processes information. And it takes that information and it generates thoughts and actions. And because it's a physical, biological organ, it can go wrong. Things can go wrong with the brain. And these things that go wrong are psychiatric and neurological disorders. Now, the medical aspects of neuroscience have tremendous practical consequences. Disorders like Alzheimer's disease, stroke, depression, schizophrenia, autism, Parkinson's disease, addiction. All of these are problems of the brain. And these are disorders that justify the expenditure of billions of dollars spent per year on neuroscience research in the United States, Europe, Japan, and an increasing number of countries around the world. And when I look at my fellow neuroscientists, I can see the same two broad reasons behind their entry into neuroscience. Roughly speaking, many of them I can see as going into the field because of either philosophical reasons or medical reasons, sometimes both. Now, one thing that's very exciting about this duality, this philosophical and medical justification, is that I get to work on an exciting and thriving discipline, one that speaks to me and speaks to many neuroscientists in a fundamental way, and it's also useful. And so it's something that matters to people's everyday lives, of their lives, and of course their loved ones. Now, in this course, here's what I'm going to be doing. I will be talking about medical disorders, but I'm also going to be focusing on this other path toward the brain, this path of thinking about our everyday existence. And fundamentally, much of this course is about everyday life. Now, neuroscience is often taught in terms of disease, but I propose to you that this is not the only way to look at brain function. We use our brains in our every action, whether we're aware of it or not. Understanding the mechanisms of brain function can illuminate our daily lives and what it means to be an individual person. Now, brains are responsible for our every experience at every level. We can think of brain functions as including so-called lower functions like breathing, walking, sleeping, and also in terms of higher functions, so-called higher functions, making decisions, loving, learning. And in this spirit, I'm going to be talking about both levels of function, low levels of function, high levels of function, always in terms of everyday life. Now, what I'd like to do is give you at first a brief tour of the brain and just show you what the brain looks like And I want to show you some of the parts that we're going to be talking about in the course of this series of lectures. Now, when we look at a brain, we see this 3-pound mass. This is a 3-pound mass that is obviously inside our skull. And it looks like the single structure, but it turns out that it's composed of many, many regions. And what I'd like to do now is take you through a little tour of the individual components of the brain. Now, if we just look at the outside of the intact brain, what we can start seeing is big regions of the brain, this external part of the brain. Most of what we can see here is the neocortex. The neocortex, also called the cerebral cortex, occupies about 3/4 of the brain. And this 3/4 of the brain is something that's distinctive about our brains. We have a larger neocortex proportionally as a fraction of brain than any other species, and it's this large component of the brain. It's this distinctive feature. So one aspect of brain organization, brain function, is that sensory information is mapped onto this exterior brain surface. And we can look on the surface of the neocortex, and one of the first things that people discovered when they started mapping out the neocortex was functions having to do with sensory function. So if we look here, we can see, for instance, up here, we can see the somatosensory cortex. This is a part of the cortex that's important for somatic sensation, touch. We also have the auditory cortex, which receives sound information, and the visual cortex. Now, the visual cortex is a big part of the cortex. Something like 40% of the brains of the neocortex seems to be dedicated in one way or another to visual functions. Now, these sensory regions are, of course, important, but they're just a small part of what brains do. And what I want to do now is to start stripping away these parts, to take out this exterior rind, this cortex, and get a picture to show you an image of the brain at its core, and start with the core and think about what we can find in here. And what we're going to be doing in this course is talking about many of these regions in turn, and what I'm going to do right now is start building them up and showing you these brain regions. Now, all that sensory information I described comes through pathways that lead from regions that are harder to see from the outside. So these pathways of information that come into the brain, so nerves come in the spinal cord, pass up the spinal cord, and that information then passes into the brain, passes through regions such as the brainstem and also the thalamus. In addition, we have cranial nerves, and so these cranial nerves are primarily in the head, thus their name. And so these cranial nerves, again, are pathways of information coming into the brainstem and thereby into other brain regions such as thalamus and neocortex. Now, one thing we can see when we look at the brain's core is that we can see core brain structures that take care of many important functions. And these core brain structures are very tightly packed in the brain, and some of them are a little bit hard to see. But these many important functions include some that I've mentioned. For instance, breathing. That's a fundamental function that relies on parts of the brainstem. But also, some of these core brain structures are important for just the fact that we're conscious at all. So for instance, if we look in the reticular formation, there are these columns of neurons in the brainstem that are important for just making us conscious, able to walk around, talk, and be aware of the world. And so the reticular formation is here in the brain's core. Many functions that are essential for everyday living, for just existence, are in these core structures. And as I said, they're packed very tightly in the brainstem and in the midbrain. Now, some of these structures I'm going to be talking about at some depth later on in this course. For example, one brain region I'm going to be talking about is the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus is not a very large structure. It's about the size of a grape. But this small structure turns out to be really important in many functions that are essential for everyday living. So, for example, the hypothalamus plays a critical role in setting our daily rhythm, our circadian rhythm, in which we know whether it's daytime or nighttime. The hypothalamus is a critical way station for instance, conveying and generating signals of stress. So the hypothalamus receives signals that tell us when it's time to have a stress response. It also then broadcasts signals into the rest of into other regions of brain and throughout the body that convey the stress response. The hypothalamus regulates body temperature. It's responsible for expression of rage, all kinds of stuff. This little structure is very important for many functions, and so therefore we're going to be spending some time on that. Now, one signaling system you can see here in the brain's core is more distributed. It's not a particular brain region, but there are neurotransmitters that mainly do their business here in the brain's core. At least the neurons that make these neurotransmitters are central to brain function. So here's a big example. One big example is biogenic amines. Now, biogenic amines are made by neurons in these core brain regions, here and also more anteriorly. And these neurons send axons throughout the brain. So they send axons into the neocortex, into other brain regions, and even into regions such as the cerebellum and brainstem. And these biogenic amines then send their messages around the brain. And we will find here structures that secrete, for instance, serotonin. The Raphe nuclei secrete serotonin, which is important for functions as disparate as mood and movement. Another major biogenic amine is norepinephrine. You can find neurons here that secrete norepinephrine, which are important for regulating alertness. Dopamine is a major neurotransmitter, a major neuromodulator that we're going to be talking about repeatedly in this course. And dopamine turns out to be responsible for a host of functions that include attention, but also reward and movement. Again, one of these biogenic amines that seems to have multiple functions. And we'll also be talking a bit about acetylcholine. This is a neurotransmitter that's important not only in the brain, but also in the periphery. It's important for memory function, for instance, in the brain. All of these things are things that we'll find here in the brain's core, as well as signaling peptides, which are important for many basic functions from pair bonding to appetite. Now, these peptides, of course, are also active throughout the brain, but many of the neurons that secrete peptides can be found in the brain's core. Now, another aspect of this course that we're going to be covering is emotional processing. Emotional processing is a major feature of brain function. It's important not only for basal responses, just these sort of core animal responses, but it's also important for other things like decision-making and just daily experience. Emotional experience has been around for a long time, and so some of these brain regions here have been around also for a long time, evolutionarily speaking. Now, I've already mentioned the hypothalamus, but in fact there are other regions that are critically important in processing information. So for instance, the amygdala. This is a paired structure that's on the left and on the right. The amygdala is important for emotional processing for a variety of both positive and negative emotions. And the amygdala, in turn, communicates with many other brain regions. For instance, the insula, the anterior cingulate, and the orbitofrontal cortex. These are all parts of the neocortex. And so as you can see, we're starting to build up towards the neocortex, towards these structures that spend their time talking to these core structures. Now, one structure is going to come up repeatedly, and it's here and back. It's the cerebellum. So if we turn around the brain, we can look at the cerebellum. It's this very wrinkled structure. Now, the cerebellum is going to come up repeatedly. The cerebellum is a structure that seems to occupy about 1/7 of the brain in all mammals. It's about that fraction in every mammal. So it's something that's relatively fixed across evolution. And the cerebellum is important for sensory processing and for movement. So for instance, you can't make smooth movements without your cerebellum. You can't learn new movements, new graceful things like a tennis stroke or a dance step. But the cerebellum is also important in higher cognitive functions. And it's even been shown to be different in size and in structure in autism. And so the cerebellum seems to play a fairly important role in a wide variety of functions. And so we're going to be talking about this region a bit. Now, a big part of how we look at our own identity, how we think of ourselves, is memory. We think about memories of childhood, memories of our life's experiences. And one thing that we're going to be talking about in this course is memory. Now, it's important to remember that memory is not one, but many systems. But one aspect of memory that people often think of when they think about their life stories, events that have happened to them, is declarative memory. And declarative memory depends on a pair of structures that are kind of curled on either side. And so these two structures are called the hippocampus. And so you have, again, two structures, left and right hippocampus. And the formation of new declarative memories of facts, events, and places depends on the hippocampus and also adjoining regions, the hippocampus and also the medial temporal cortex. And so these are structures that we're going to be spending some time on. Okay, now we come to what I would say more uniquely human functions, things that we think of as some of our more advanced functions. And when we think about these things, we start coming to, again, back to the cortex. And if we look here, we can see some advanced functions represented in this part of the brain. The prefrontal cortex is this large part of the brain in front that has many roles that we think of as uniquely human, including participation in decision-making, what's called executive functions, so the direction of attention, the switching between tasks, working memory, the ability to remember information for 10 or 20 seconds at a time. And even willpower, our self-control, depends on the prefrontal cortex. So this part of the brain in front, the prefrontal cortex, receives a lot of inputs from other brain regions and sends signals to many other brain regions. And so we're going to be spending a fair amount of time on the prefrontal cortex. It's a region that's important to neuroscientists, also to psychologists. Now, towards the end of the course, we'll even talk about unusual phenomena such as out-of-body experiences, visions, paranormal phenomena. And these are things that you would normally think of as not being within the reach of a science, such as neuroscience, but in fact, we're going to be talking about brain regions that seem to be important for generating paranormal experiences. And these regions it turns out, are not far from the sensory regions. So if we look at the visual, auditory, and somatosensory regions, we can see regions that turn out to be important in paranormal phenomena, and they include the parietal and temporal lobes. And so I talked about the temporal lobes for memory formation. The temporal lobes are also important for these other experiences, including religious experience. And so in this way, what we're going to be doing in this course is we'll be considering all these brain regions in turn, and by the end, what I hope that we'll end up with is a sense of what the whole brain is up to by considering all of these parts together. So that's what we're going to be doing with this 3-pound object, the brain. All right. Now, I've said that we're going to be talking about these different brain regions. Now, I've said that we're going to be considering these various functions in terms of the brain structures. I've just given you a little tour of these brain structures. But what I want to also do in this lecture is give you a few examples of questions that have been illuminated and advanced by a neuroscientific perspective. Some of these things that I've already mentioned. And what I want to do is give you a little sense of what the questions looked like before the advent of neuroscience, and then give an approximate overview of what they look like to a neuroscientist, what they look like to us now, with the advantage of having the accomplishments of the last few decades. So here's one question. I'll give you 3 questions. So one question is a question related to my original reasons for getting into neuroscience, and it's the perception of red. So this was originally conceived as a philosophical question. What do you and I perceive? So if you see the color red, and if I see the color red, do we see the same thing? Is there something qualitatively similar between what you and I see? Now, this is something that seemed to be uninvestigatable by philosophical approaches, and that was probably true. It was something that people could think about, but now what we have is a more modern neuroscientific view. And the more modern neuroscientific view is that in addition to these brain regions that I just showed you, there are in fact deep similarities between persons and even between animals. And these similarities occur at all levels of structure. They occur at the levels of circuits, of brain regions that talk to one another. I showed you some of those just now. Also at the level of cells and signals, even at the level of molecules. There are signaling molecules that are shared between us and all animals, and those molecules seem to be shared. And so if we ask the question, does red look the same to you or me? In fact, we share circuitry that is very similar between you and me, in which neural processing starts in the retina, in the eyes, and goes to the brain. And in fact, stops at many locations in between. And there's lots of stuff happening in the visual pathways that seems to be similar from individual to individual. In fact, there are advanced visual areas for color, and those play a role in us now thinking about how we perceive color. And furthermore, there are developmental steps that set up all these things throughout development that are, again, the same in nearly all of us. This is a deep principle of how brains are put together. Here's another example, dreams. Now, dream interpretation has been around for a long time. The history of dream interpretation dates back to ancient times, and people used to be interested in dreams as perhaps telling the future. If we fast forward a few thousand years, then we see things like dreams revealing our hidden desires, right? So that was an idea that Freud was very interested in. And these are ideas about what dreams were, because of course dreams are these puzzling experiences in which things seem real but not real. Now, if we think about dreams, it turns out that now it's become possible to start measuring neurophysiological correlates, measuring events that happen inside the brain while we dream. And if we look at modern neuroscience, there are neuroscientific findings from physiology that tell us a little bit more about dreams and what they are. For instance, dreams seem to be patterns of activity that are activated in our brains while our cortex is allowed to be active, but in fact our body is shut down so that we can't act out our experiences. Now, it turns out that there are interesting things that happen during dreams, and it's possible to start going in and recording and seeing things that happen in the brain while we dream. So, for example, it's now realized that, in fact, there are activity patterns that happen during waking life that happen in the same order in an animal. It's been found that you can find things in the brain of a rat or of a bird that suggest that there's something that happens while they sleep that is similar to what happens while they're awake. And in some sense, it's now believed that rats dream of their mazes, birds dream of their songs. It's also believed that that these reactivation patterns may play a role not in revealing hidden desires, but in doing something very different, and that something very different is consolidating memory. So there seems to be something that goes on in dreaming that may be important. This is an active area of investigation, not settled, in which the replay of activity that happens during the day may play a role in making our memories more secure, in consolidating our memories. Third example, early development. If we look at disorders of early development, they looked pretty different a long time ago. So if we think about previous traditional beliefs, we can see examples such as the phenomenon of the village idiot, someone who lived in the town and was feeble-minded without any distinction of exactly what it is that is wrong with them. Some sufferers from this feeble-mindedness were the subject of exorcisms. The belief was that they had evil spirits inside them, and so therefore what was called for was to perform an exorcism and get rid of those evil spirits. Another phenomenon is perhaps wolf boys and wolf girls. So the idea that perhaps somebody was raised by wolves, and the reason that they are the way they are is that they've been raised by wolves and then they return to civilization unable to live in polite society. Now, in recent decades, these ideas have been modified, but in recent decades, there were other ideas that came from people like Freud and Bettelheim, the idea that somehow these kids are messed up because of their mother's influence, that the mother has influenced their development in some fundamental way. It turns out that all of these ideas are wrong. It turns out that with a modern understanding, we now understand that these disorders are known to be genetic. They start in early development, often before birth, before the baby meets mom. And these disorders often affect specific brain regions. And so it appears to be an early genetic defect that leads to problems by the time of birth. And this includes syndromes that we now don't call feeble-mindedness, but now we call things like Down syndrome or autism. Now, we're going to be talking about these and other phenomena at different levels of biology. And what I'm hoping to do for you in this course is to give you explanations for these kinds of phenomena at very different levels of components and brain organization. And so if we look at the brain, we can see that, in fact, there are many different levels of physical explanation. And depending on exactly the kind of explanation we're going to come up with, we're going to be talking at very different levels of structure. We may talk about chemicals, the neurotransmitters that neurons use to talk with one another. We might talk about the arrangement of circuits, for instance, the arrangement of a particular brain region, the organization of it, and what cells might be responsible. We might talk about neurotransmitters that are secreted in a particular brain region. We may even talk about some of these brain regions that I've shown you and how they communicate with one another. So one way of explaining these phenomena is that we're going to be looking at different levels of brain function, and depending on what the question is, we're going to be looking for explanations at these different levels of structure. And so what we talk about is going to vary from lecture to lecture in terms of what level of structure we discuss. We're also going to talk about these phenomena in terms of mechanisms. So we're going to be talking about the mechanisms by which brains get to where they are. And I've already touched upon that in the context of Down syndrome and autism. And so in this regard, we're going to be talking about the interplay of factors that make brains what they are, the factors that make us who we are as we walk around. And these factors include genetics, the inheritance of DNA sequence that we get from our parents, developmental stages starting from very early development, and also through childhood, adolescence, and even adulthood throughout life. I'll talk about environmental influences, anything ranging from nutritional influences to childhood stimulation, words that we hear when we're babies, experiences that we have when we're children, nutritional factors, all of these things that make a contribution to how we develop. And finally, of course, experience. The daily experiences that we have that get stored, that get processed, that get turned into who we are cumulatively over our lifetimes. Now, all of these are different ways of looking at the brain, and all of these are different ways of thinking about explanations for how brains generate behavior and how we generate our daily experience. And so what I'm going to be doing in this course is taking all these different approaches to help understand the brain and ourselves a little bit better.